Okay, it's about 11:02, so it's probably time for us to make a start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Managing Your Business Out of the Pandemic. My name is Michael Frape, and I'm Chairman of Ashtons Legal and a partner in the dispute resolution team. My role is to chair the webinar and deliver the first section of it. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jeremy Hyde, who is a regional director in the FD Centre, and also by Paul Whittingham, who is head of Ashtons Business Law Group and a partner in the company commercial team. Before we get going, three housekeeping points. So first, the running order. I will first set the background economic scene and suggest where you might find post-COVID winners and losers. I will then address what I believe to be the 5 key legal issues for protecting your business. That will take around 12 minutes. Paul will follow me and address due diligence issues in the business sale process, and he will speak for about 10 minutes. Jeremy will conclude the webinar with a presentation on operational finance and strategic financial management, and will talk for about 20 minutes. Secondly, questions. Please post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go along. There are 2 reasons for this. First, you won't forget what you wanted to ask. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it will give us time to work out what the answer is. Please also say who you want to answer the question. Feedback is the final point. Please fill in the feedback form. It's important. So why are we holding this webinar? We thought that business leaders and connectors would find it helpful to pause and take stock as we begin to emerge from the crisis and consider what are the key legal issues and finance issues for businesses to focus on as they decide whether either to A, trade out of the economic crisis, or B, get their business ready for an exit. So what is the economic background and who are the potential business winners and losers? We all recall that on 23rd March last year, Boris Johnson announced the first lockdown. Since then, we have lived through the greatest health crisis in a century and the worst economic crisis and downturn since the Great Frost of 1709. According to a Chinese saying, it is better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos. I want to focus on 3 economic areas of significance to business before suggesting some sectors which may be winners or perhaps losers. They are the economy, employment, and the UK government. First, the economy. The bad news is that UK PLC suffered 9.8% negative economic growth in 2020. The good news, however, is that the OBR expects the economy to rebound and grow by 5.5% this year. Second, employment. The bad news is that the latest unemployment figures for the 3 months ending February 2021 confirm that 4.9% of the workforce, or 1.67 million people, are unemployed. Since the crisis began, 811,000 payroll jobs have disappeared, and the vast majority of those jobs have gone in hotels, restaurants, pubs, and shops, with the under 35s hardest hit by job losses as they make up 80% of those cuts. Unemployment is set to increase this year, possibly to 2.2 million, but the good news is that unemployment should decline next year. Finally, UK government. The good news has been the success of the furlough scheme and other government support measures such as the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, which have helped to protect the economy and also save jobs. The furlough scheme has protected more than 11 million jobs since the pandemic began, an astounding number when you consider that the UK workforce is about 28 million people, almost a third. The bad news is, however, that in order to finance those measures, the UK government has had to borrow huge sums of money, including 250 billion in the last fiscal year alone, and the total cost of fighting the pandemic may be around 400 billion, eye-watering numbers. This may mean, therefore, a new age of austerity And we do know, however, for certain that taxes will be going up substantially, with corporation tax set to rise for most companies to 25% from April 2023. So what might this mean for business? We've probably had 10 years of business change in 12 months. This is certainly a seismic moment in the history of UK PLC, and most commentators do not believe that business life will go back to pre-COVID times. It is very difficult to pick winners and losers, as there are a large number of variables, including A, how the health crisis will pan out and how large it will be, B, the shape and size of the economic recovery, and C, the extent and effect of the permanent scarring on the economy. I should add, for the avoidance of doubt, that what follows is not investment advice. I would suggest that shareholder value will be seriously impaired for a significant period in business sectors which rely on person-to-person contact and which will continue to be adversely affected by social distancing measures. This means big challenges for bricks and mortar based retail, hospitality and leisure, and the travel and tourism industry. It will also be challenging to be a landlord with investments in those sectors, and also landlords of large purpose-built office space. The converse of that is that shareholder value should increase in businesses which are unaffected by or can adjust to social distancing measures, such as manufacturing, mining and natural resources, agriculture. Businesses which can conduct most of their business in the digital world, such as the tech sector, online marketing, online gambling, and online retail, will prosper. For example, Amazon's share price has increased by 73% in 2020. Service sector industries which can transition to the digital world will also do well. I'm thinking of finance, banking, and professional services too. In closing, it is worth thinking where we would have been if we didn't have smartphones, laptops, and the internet. So that concludes the introduction and sets the scene, hopefully, for what follows. So I'd like to move now on to my section of the webinar, which is what I believe to be the 5 key legal issues for protecting your business. Those 5 issues are, next slide please, funding, contracts, IPR, people, and regulatory compliance. Given time constraints, my approach will be to pose questions and raise issues rather than necessarily provide answers or solutions. So, funding. Funding is a mission critical area for all businesses, of course, and any business which is bank funded needs to be certain of its financing and the availability of credit to fund working capital requirements. This is especially so during a period of severe economic turbulence, as has been caused by COVID. I raised 3 issues specifically. First, covenants in facility agreements. If you borrow from a bank, you will have to sign a facility agreement. It will impose many and often onerous covenants on you as borrower. The facility agreement will normally run to maybe 4 pages, but as ever, the devil will be in the detail, which are the standard terms, which often run to 50 or more pages. I can reassure you that the banks have developed and honed their standard terms to cover every possible eventuality. For example, there might be a material change in control covenant. That provision may include any change in the management team. If you breach such a covenant, that will be an event of default, entitling the bank to call in the loan. To state the obvious, you should avoid an event of default at all costs. If you do breach a covenant, there are 3 options for the bank. First, they can waive the breach if it's minor or unimportant. They can repaper the loan, or they can enforce it. Prevention being better than the cure, what should you do? Well, the golden rule is to read and fully understand each and every provision in the standard terms. If you don't understand or you don't like a term, you should get legal advice. If you are borrowing more than £1 million, there is, in fact, a possibility of negotiating the terms. contact your lawyer. Break clauses. Beware break clauses. Why? They give the bank the option to renegotiate terms at their option. And this is especially so if the cost of funding has changed, such as after the 2008 financial crisis and presumably after also this crisis. Finally, personal guarantees. 2 words about personal guarantees: don't. But if you must, the golden rule is to negotiate a fixed limit to the liability. On no account agree to an unlimited liability or to pay an amount you might not be able to afford to pay on demand. Next slide, please. So the second legal issue is contracts. I would question how many businesses actively review provisions of their standard terms and their contracting process. Your objective should be to contract on the most favorable terms to you and not on the terms of your supplier or customer. First, standard terms. Nearly every business has standard terms and conditions, but I have 3 questions for you. Do you have a separate set of terms and conditions for purchases as well as sales? Secondly, have your terms and conditions been drafted specifically for your business? And finally, do you regularly review and update your terms and conditions to keep pace with changes in the law? The second issue here is the contracting process. Having bespoke sale and purchase terms and conditions which are regularly updated is only one half of an important equation, which is getting your terms to apply to the contract. The second half is your contracting process, and this is the so-called battle of the forms. In the battle of the forms, the traditional view is that the last shot prevails. In other words, conventional wisdom has it that the contracting party which fires the last shot will be successful in imposing their terms and conditions on the other party. A recent case has, however, confirmed that it is possible with careful drafting to ensure that your terms and conditions will apply even if you have not fired the last shot. Next slide, please. So on to IPR. Intellectual property rights are important for nearly every business, but I'm not addressing here businesses in the tech sector, such as life science businesses or big pharma, which rely on inventions as the core of their business. I'm talking about your common or garden business, where IPR is nevertheless important. Some issues for you to consider as follows. Trademarks. Have you registered your brand as a trademark, not just registered your name at Companies House? And if you have registered your trademarks, do they in fact protect you in every country where you manufacture, distribute, or sell goods or services? Designs. Have you registered your designs, which might include website layouts as well as product designs? And do you have, in terms of copyright, do you have proper processes in place to record your copyright works? And do you have proper copyright notices on any work in which copyright may or can subsist? And what about ownership issues? Are you sure that the IP created by third parties with which you have contracted, i.e. not employees, vest in you? IPR will vest in the creator and will remain there unless expressly assigned to you and your business. Finally, have you got non-disclosure agreements in place? And do you carry out checks before launching new brands or products in the market? Next slide, please. And what about people? Well, for many businesses, your people are your most important asset. But are you protecting those assets? And are you protecting your business from the harm that can be done by ex-employees? The first question is whether your employees have up-to-date and well-drafted employment contracts which contain post-termination restrictions, such as non-competition, non-solicitation, non-dealing, non-poaching, and confidentiality. If the contract or if your contracts do contain post-termination restrictions, are you confident that the provisions are enforceable? Whether they are will depend on several factors, including the precise terms and how they apply to the facts in question, whether those terms are fair and reasonable, and whether those terms protect your legitimate business interests. If there are no post-termination restrictions, you may have very significant difficulties in protecting your business, and you do need to ensure that they are valid and enforceable. So what happens after termination if there is no contractual provision? Let's look first at trade secrets and also confidential information. Well, trade secrets are things like secret processes, formulae, ingredients, or methods. And you'll be pleased to know that they will be protected even if there are no post-termination restrictions. But have you identified and informed your employees what are your trade secrets? Confidential information. The strong likelihood is that you will find it extremely difficult to protect confidential information from disclosure after the end of employment unless you have express confidentiality clauses. And also, have you identified and notified your employees what is your confidential information? The golden rule is ensure all key staff have up-to-date and well-drafted employment contracts with valid and enforceable post-termination restrictions. In my experience, I'm sad to say, such matters are often addressed after the sales director and the entire sales team have left for a competitor rather than before that happens. Next slide, please. Finally, regulatory. All businesses trade in an increasingly regulated environment. Being regulatory compliant is therefore very important. Even if you don't need a permit or license to run your business, it is essential that you comply with the law. It is also important you take every reasonable step to manage your risk. Just focusing on risk for a moment. Managing risk means systems, processes, and records. Do you have those systems, processes, and records in place? And are they all properly organized? Documentation. If you need a permit or license to run your business, how are you managing and documenting your relationship with your regulator? Documentation is incredibly important because it shows what you have done and how you have complied. But what happens if you breach a permit or license? Well, almost as night follows day, there will be an investigation. Investigations are timely, risky, and costly for all businesses. The golden rule is to seek legal advice as soon as you become aware that you have breached a license, and certainly well before any investigation has begun. What about criminal liability? Well, it might be a surprise for some of you to know that directors can be prosecuted for the activities of their company. Even if you trade through a limited company, it is possible for directors to be held criminally liable. And regulators and prosecutors have wide-ranging powers to seek the imposition of court fines. Bear in mind, please, that fines are now based on turnover, not profits. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, prosecutors can seek confiscation orders, and confiscation orders are also based on turnover, not profits. Some regulators can impose civil penalties, such as the Information Commissioner. Finally, a word of warning about tenders and contracts. If you put in a bid for a tender, are you completely sure that it is safe to sign the declaration at the end of the bid? that declaration is ever so important. You must read it, you must understand it, and you certainly must comply with it. If the bid document contains information which is not correct, you could be committing a criminal offence. And if you win the tender, the turnover, not the profit from that contract, could be proceeds of crime, which is recoverable by a confiscation order. So sorry to end on a rather negative note, but those are the 5 points I consider are incredibly important for you to protect your business in these turbulent and challenging economic times. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Paul Whittingham, to address issues in the due diligence process. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. Right, that's me. Could I have the next slide, please? So how many times have you seen this expression, never waste a good crisis? It's been very relevant over the last year. And it's also equally true that disruption, like we've experienced, creates opportunity. Next slide, please. So the opportunities I'm thinking of are the fact that some companies have come through the pandemic really well. They've managed to maintain their turnover. They've benefited from furlough schemes and other government assistance and are actually feeling in a pretty strong position. By contrast, other companies have had a really rough time of it and have not survived so well and are perhaps thinking of maybe getting out of the market. Now, of course, disruption does create opportunities. So there are companies that we've been talking to who've got a bit of a war chest as a consequence of what's been going on and are looking to grow through acquisition. Similarly, there are others who are looking to sell. So there is plenty of opportunity out there now that the economy is beginning to pick up and look more lively, as Michael was saying earlier. Now, whether you're a buyer or a seller, you will encounter the process of due diligence, which is essentially looking into all the affairs of the target company. So its accounts, its contracts, employees, its tax, pensions, properties, intellectual property, all the sort of things that Michael was talking about just now. Now, they do say that the best way to learn is to learn from your own mistakes, but there is actually a better way, which is to learn from the mistakes of other people or their experiences. So I'm going to give some real life examples of things that we've encountered in due diligence, which have had to be resolved one way or another, which hopefully will guide you in how to either look out for things in target companies when you're buying, or to get things in order in your own company if you're thinking of selling. So next slide, please. So some of these actually have been chosen because they illustrate some of the points that Michael was making a few moments ago. So the first one, the lack of license, hopefully no one will spot it. This relates to a business. I've changed the name for confidentiality reasons, but the guy had started a business which we'll call Electrical World, and he was selling kit to consumers. So he got himself a consumer credit license and was selling stuff on HP and leasing and so forth. It started doing very well, so he incorporated the business and called it Electrical World Limited. He thought, I've already got a consumer credit license that says Electrical World on the front, so I don't really need to do anything about that. But on due diligence, obviously, it was picked up the fact that the company that was now trading didn't have one. So the buyer pointed out to him that as a consequence of being unlicensed, all the consumer credit agreements he'd entered into since incorporation were unenforceable. So he was required to give an indemnity in relation to any defaults that customers made, because they would not be capable of being enforced by the company. Fortunately, there weren't any defaults, but it could have been quite an expensive oversight on his part. The next one, I thought it must be mine if I paid for it. Well, Michael mentioned about the ownership of IPR, and it is a popular misconception. If you commission a work, so the writing of software, the production of a photograph, content for a website, something like that, then if you've paid for it, you must own it. Well, you're granted a license to use it, but you don't necessarily own the copyright unless and until the external party assigns it to you expressly. So the example I've got here is a software company that we were selling a few years ago, and it was being bought by a large French company, and the completion meeting was taking place in Paris, which I discovered is an even more glamorous place to complete a deal than Ipswich. The buyer noticed that one of the software products had not had the copyright assigned to it and had been developed by consultants who, although working in-house, were a separate entity. So we actually emailed a document across to the consultancy and asked them to sign an assignment of the copyright to the target company, which mercifully they duly did and sent it straight back. So that was resolved. Change of control clauses. Now, these are the clauses which give a right for a contracting party to terminate the contract with the target company if the ownership of that company changes. So that's a risk that you face on a company sale. And we had a sale of a maritime business a couple of years ago, which had a very valuable distribution agreement with a French boat manufacturer. And the buyer was so worried about the change of control clause potentially being invoked and ripping the value out of the business that he and the sellers went over to meet the owners of the French boat company in France and got them comfortable with the buyer. And on the back of that, they then signed a document saying they would not exercise their change of control rights. The right of termination arising from the change of control. So that was an example of how to do it properly. The share option example relates to what are called enterprise management incentive options, which you may be familiar with. These options confer very substantial tax benefits on the employees, particularly if they exercise them just before a company sale. However, like all tax advantaged schemes, they do have a lot of rules and thresholds which have to be observed, including particularly the amount of share capital which can be under option at any time. The client in this case had, through his previous solicitors, put in place an EMI scheme. Documentation was absolutely fine, working very well. So he thought, I'll do another one, and he didn't bother to check either with his lawyers or accountants whether issuing another batch of them would go through any of the thresholds, which in fact it did. So it meant, unfortunately, that not only did the second batch of options not qualify for the tax advantages, but it also retrospectively invalidated the tax advantages on the first round. So when the company was sold a few months later, there were some very disgruntled employees who found that their share options, when exercised, gave rise to a much bigger tax bill than they'd been led to believe. The question of leases and how perfected they are is something we come across quite often. The particular example I'm thinking of was a company selling to a financial institution that wasn't prepared to take a view on anything. And it turned out all three leasehold sites were imperfect in the sense they didn't have proper title. So, for example, one of them, the landlord had not granted written consent to the assignment as required under the lease. And another one, the previous tenant hadn't actually signed the assignment. And although the occupant said, well, it's all right, we've been here for years, there's never been a problem, the buyer wasn't willing to take the risk. So we had to do a lot of rectification work to get all these things sorted out before the deal could even proceed. And then the final example is self-employed drivers. Now, my employment law colleagues could probably spend all day talking about the recent Uber case and the usual dilemma as to whether somebody is genuinely self-employed or whether they're actually an employee, or the halfway house position, which is so-called worker. The example I'm thinking of related to a company that distributed goods to the restaurant trade in London and home counties, and they used a fleet of self-employed drivers to deliver these goods. Now, the drivers owned their own vans. They could potentially go and work for anybody else. They didn't have to turn up and deliver stuff for this particular company. But in practice, quite a lot of them did work 5 days a week just for this company, and there was quite a lot of control as to how they did their work. So the buyer's due diligence report said that there was a risk that the revenue might not accept that they were genuinely self-employed, and the consequence on the company could be that it could be assessed to PAYE and national insurance on the sums paid to those drivers, possibly going back 6 years. So the buyer, which was a private equity house, insisted on an unlimited indemnity in case there were such claims made by the revenue. Our client offered an indemnity capped at £1 million, but they said, unless you make it in unlimited, we're walking away. So he gave an unlimited indemnity and held his breath for 6 years. And mercifully, there were no claims on the indemnity. But it just shows how important it is to be mindful of the distinction between employment and self-employment, and the fact that the revenue can decide whether calling somebody self-employed is actually sufficient, and whether, if the relationship is like an employment relationship, they can decide that it should be taxed as one. Next slide, please. Now, I don't know if any of you are thinking of either buying a company and subjecting the target to due diligence, or whether you're thinking that you might yourselves sell within the next few years, in which case you might be thinking, well, how would we stand up to a due diligence exercise? Would we survive it if it was imposed upon us? Well, after the seminar has finished, we're going to email you one of these beasts, which is actually a due diligence questionnaire, which runs to 34 pages actually, and asks you all kinds of questions about your business, and you can test yourself as to whether you would survive a due diligence exercise, or whether there are things that you might need to sort out and put in place between now and an eventual sale. So that's all I have to say on that for now. So with great pleasure, I'd like to hand over to Jeremy Hyde from the FD Centre. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. So what a year we've had. COVID, Brexit. I can't think of a more disrupted 12 months in business than what we've seen over the last year. And now we have the recovery, which brings on its own challenges and the uncertainties as well, as identified by Michael in his economic outlook that he described earlier. But you know, with the right financial management, your business will survive and indeed can thrive, no matter what the challenges are that are thrown up by the dynamic business environment that you're operating in within. And over the course of the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you some of the key aspects of effective financial management, operational and strategic financial management, that will help you through these uncertain times. And I'll describe that within the context of the business journey. And before I start that, I'd like you to take a moment to think about what it is that you want from your business. All successful business journeys start with the end in mind. What's your end in mind? It might be to grow your business to a certain level of turnover or profit. It might even be to exit, to sell your business, in which case, how much do you want for it and when do you want to sell it? It may be non-financial. Your end in mind may be to discover and develop the cure for an unmet disease need, and there's plenty of those around at the moment. Or it might be to help save the environment. It really doesn't matter what your end in mind is, as long as you have one. And from there, we can reverse engineer and identify the key steps that will take you from where you are today to that end in mind, which is your strategic plan, your business strategy. And most businesses, when they start, they're owner-led, and they're exciting times. The business is growing, and what tends to happen is the owner is involved in everything, from selling the products to delivering the products and services, and all the administration and the financial responsibilities that go with it. But the business nevertheless grows really well in those early days. But most businesses get to a point where there's too much for one person to do. And those businesses you will often see they will plateau, and that growth that was experienced in those early years tends to fall away. And it's at that point when the business owner needs to bring in people around them, people with expertise in the areas that they don't necessarily have themselves. One of those experts is a finance director. And typically, businesses that at this size, they're too small to need a full-time finance director, and probably can't afford one, but they do need the strategic input of an experienced finance director to help them take their business to the next level, which is where the part-time finance director role works really well. And the finance director will identify the systems and the processes and the information that you need for better decision making and for monitoring and improving your performance. We call this the operational benefits. This is about getting underneath the skin of the numbers, identifying which customers are profitable, which products and services are making you money, where are you losing money, what's your cost base, what are the cost drivers, can you reduce costs, what about pricing? All of those questions and that analysis is about identifying opportunities to improve the profitability of your business. Also within this area is cash flow management. As we know, accountants and finance systems, they're great at reporting historical profit and loss information, but not as good at understanding the cash flow dynamics in the business, particularly forward-looking cash flow. What does the next 12 months look like? Are there any pinch points? Are there any gaps that will need bridging? And it's the FD's role to look at this. And as we go into this recovery period, which is an exciting period, it's an exciting thought as business starts to move forward again and revenue starts to increase, that can be a vulnerable time for businesses. And in fact, many businesses that run out of cash, it's not because they're not selling much, it's actually the reverse. It's one of the paradoxes of the business world that businesses that run out of cash, very often, they're victims of their own success and their top line is growing really effectively. But that can cause issues and really challenges on the cash flow and the working capital management. I have a case study to share with you. It's a business services group, and this was no exception. It's quite relevant to those businesses that over the next 6 to 12 months are looking at significant growth. This business was profitable, making profits of 4.6 million. But in the year we started working with this business, it had consumed 3.3 million in cash flow against a profit of 4.6 million. So we took a look under the bonnet and we identified that just a 1% improvement across 7 key levers in this business could increase cash flow by over £1 million and increase profits by 924,000. So we spoke to the owner, and this was a classic response from an entrepreneur, which is why I love working with small businesses. If I increase my sales volume by 20%, surely that will resolve my cash flow issues and increase my profits. As you can see from the slides here, just a 1% increase in sales volume requires an additional cash flow working capital funding of 43,000. So it doesn't take a finance genius to realise that if this business continued to grow its sales volume and didn't do anything else, it would eventually run out of cash. It was more complex than that. We needed to take a deeper dive into the financial aspects of the business and identify other areas which would help improve the cash and the profitability situation. So we implemented a number of improvements across a number of levers within the business. And the net impact of that was an increase in profits of £2.1 million. And more importantly, an increase of 3.8 million in cash flow, transforming this business from a cash consumer to a cash generator. The main contributor, one of the key contributors to this improvement in the cash and profitability was in pricing. And very often when we suggest making price increase to our clients, we're met with a look of horror. And if I increase my prices, I'm going to lose business to the competition. And that may well be true. So increasing pricing isn't a way to do across the board without thinking, and this company was no exception. There were a number of customers here that were quite price sensitive. They didn't want to see, couldn't take a significant price increase. On the other hand, there were a number of customers who were more focused on the quality and the reliability of the business and the services that it provided. Some of them hadn't had a price increase for over 3 years. So there was a great opportunity to look at the different customers and the customer groups and bring in a significant price increase that had a major impact on the business, as you can see, increase in profits of 2.1 million, and more importantly, an increase in cash flow of 1.7 million. Another key contributor to the improvement was debtor days. And having an active finance and credit control function, chasing down outstanding debts, contacting major customers just before they're due to pay is a great way to reduce the cash tied up in debtors. But even before you start to sell to customers, negotiating favourable terms that recognise the strains and the constraints on working capital will help in this area. So having advance payments or progress payments for long-term projects is a great way to relieve the working capital. And this business, a bit like the pricing, again, it wasn't a case just changing everybody's terms. That would have created other challenges. There were many customers in this business that were quite cash sensitive and they enjoyed their terms. They didn't want to change. There were others, on the other hand, they were comfortable. They weren't particularly cash sensitive. They were happy to make advance payments and progress payments where necessary. Many of the repeat customers, we moved across to direct debits so that negated the need for chasing outstanding debts, and we were able to collect the cash earlier, which also relieved working capital. The net impact of all of that work was an increase of 1.7 million in cash flow. But what does all this mean? We've increased profitability by 2.1 million. We've increased the cash flow by 3.8 million. But what about the impact and the value of the business? As a result of the changes that we made here, this business increased its value by 10.4 million pounds. And at the time when we first started working the business, had it sold, the proceeds from the sale, less the debts that the owner had, the owner was effectively in a negative equity position to the tune of around 300,000. As a result of the improvements here, the owner was now worth over 10 million pounds. And it's important to say at this point, this was focused only on the operational aspects. It was the same customers, same products and services, but we were managing the financials much more effectively. Net impact, 10.4 million pounds. I have another case study to share with you, but before we do that, let's return to your business journey. And if you could just click the slide on one more. So we've talked about the operational benefits and that end in mind. The next area is strategic management, and the strategic benefits that a finance director will bring to your business is a real game changer. And that's the piece that accelerates that journey and that progress towards the end in mind that we talked about. So let's have a look at the strategic benefits and the strategic elements of strategic financial management on the next slide. So if you just click on one more on the slide, that would be great. So strategic financial management, it starts with the strategic plan. This is your strategic plan for sales and marketing, for going out there and finding, selling to, and growing your business to customers and new customers. It's also the operational plan, how you're going to deliver those products and services. And of course, the financial plan, which underpins the entire business strategy and ensures that it's not only commercially viable, but it's also financially viable as well. And within that is funding. Ideally, your business will be self-funding based on organic growth. But very often with ambitious, high scale-up plans, there is additional funding required, particularly at the early stages. So it can be debt, equity, invoice financing is a great facility for businesses that are undergoing rapid sales growth, which could be something that many businesses will be experiencing over the coming 6 to 12 months. It's the FD's role to identify the various sources and select the right source that matches the needs of the business. But it doesn't end there. The strategic plan or the business strategy and all the elements it's a way of working. It's not a plan that you put together to raise finance or to put on the shelf and have a look in 5 years' time. How did we do? It's very much a way of working. And naturally, business owners and their teams are focused on the day-to-day activities of the business. And that's the right thing to be doing. But the problem is they're not always looking at that big picture. And it's the FD's role very much to bring that to life, to make that strategic plan, that route map, to be very much part of everybody's day job. So yes, everyone's focused on the day-to-day, it's got to be done, but they've also got one eye on the big picture. What do I need to deliver this month, this quarter, to deliver and take us towards that end in mind? And of course, we operate in a dynamic environment. If we've seen over the last 12 months, and we will see over the coming 2 years as well, I'm sure. And this requires us to continually look and adapt and evolve our strategy. The end in mind may well stay the same, but the way we get there will need to be reviewed. And the FD, working with you and your teams, looking at the different strategic options, and there's naturally a bit of excitement and energy and emotion that goes into this sort of reinventing yourself and thinking about what we can do. It's really important that those things are evaluated and that we use facts and figures to sort of work through those in selecting the optimal solutions for your business. And as I'm talking about inventing ourselves and evolving, it reminds me of a client that we had, a client that hosted wine tasting events in their premises in London, and they had another set of premises in the south. And with the COVID lockdown, their business could have been finished. So they reinvented themselves. They started hosting those events remotely, sending the wine and the cheese to people's addresses so they could link in via Zoom and enjoy the wine tasting experience from the comfort of their own homes. That business is now more successful and bigger than it was before COVID happened. And it's a great example of a business and a team thinking about how can we reinvent ourselves? How can we make the most of the changes that we're seeing in the environment? And finally, risk management. Not the most exciting subject, talking to business owners about what can go wrong, but nevertheless, really important. And thinking about how do we plan in the event that something happens. And whilst we can't stop many events from happening, at least if we've thought through, we have a business continuity, disaster recovery or insurance, whatever it is, we know in the worst case scenario, our business will survive. Let's move on now to the final case study. And this is a retail client of ours, and this touches on the strategic aspects as well as the operational aspects of finance that I talked about earlier in the other case study. This was a business that was originally set up in 1974 by a husband and wife team. They set the business up from their front room, and the business grew, and eventually they needed to move to some dedicated retail premises. That business continued to grow, and eventually they needed to move to a much bigger site. And that growth journey continued and it was nearly 30 years later. Their business had grown to 20 million turnover. And the problem was, it wasn't particularly profitable, making profits of less than £1 million a year and with real cash flow issues. So they reached out to the FD Centre and asked if we could have a look and support them in the business. And we identified a number of opportunities for improving the operational aspects of the business, so improving the cash flow issues and the profitability. This business was growing rapidly, so we needed to implement more sophisticated systems and processes to deal with inventory management and dealing with the return of sales. Also getting the right people. As this business was growing, it was becoming more complex. It needed higher caliber people to deal with a more complex business and processes. And in addition to all the operational aspects, the other question was, how are we going to continue this growth? This business had grown significantly over the last 30 or so years, but what was the strategy for the continued growth of this business? And this was in the days when online marketing was really becoming much more prevalent in the business world. And that became a key part of the sales and marketing strategy of this business, as did geographical expansion overseas. So we worked on that, and the business continued to grow well. But it became clear as we were working with the owners that their end in mind was actually outside the business. They'd worked really hard over the years, and they wanted to realise the value of all the hard work they put in over the years. They wanted to exit the business and pursue interests outside of their company. So we started to work on the exit journey and getting the house in order, ready for sale. And it was 3 years later the business sold for £70 million, which at the time represented a profit multiple of over 23 times. And during the 3 years that we worked with this business, the turnover more than doubled from 20 million to 40 million. But more importantly, the profitability more than trebled to over £3 million, and the cash flow issues were resolved. And it's stories like this, which is why I joined the FD Centre. Some of the journeys that we're on, some of the journeys we've been on, are exciting and rewarding for everybody involved. So if you're looking to grow the profitability, cash flow, and ultimately the value of your business and achieve something like this, then come and talk to us. We love working with small businesses, and we'd be delighted to take a look under the bonnet of your financials and identify how we can help you realise your full potential. I'm conscious that that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour into the world of finance, and we've covered a lot over the course of the 3 presentations this morning. So now is the opportunity to go to you to ask for any questions that might fill in some of the gaps from what you've heard this morning. And at this point, I'll hand over to Michael, who will be taking some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you also, Paul, for your fascinating presentations. And I'm sure that all those listening will be very interested in the growth journeys that you elaborated there. Very convincing and really helpful. So we've got a couple of questions, and I've got one myself. So these are not surprisingly directed to you, Jeremy, because most business people are interested in how they can achieve better numbers, and that's generally achieved via a finance director. So first of all, what sectors does the FD Centre work in?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question, Michael. And I'm pleased to say that we operate in all sectors. We're not afraid of any sector. We have 250 part-time FDs now working with the team across the UK. So you can imagine the knowledge and the experience of that group of senior FDs. We operate in all sectors, whether it's tech, whether it's construction, manufacturing. We have knowledge in all of them. And it's not just the sector as well, it's the different types of work. So we've got experts in raising finance, implementing systems, going through exits, so that the combination of the different people that we have and the expertise we have in the business can support businesses in any sector with any kind of project or work that they might need.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That's a very impressive breadth of coverage. The second question is, in terms of the building services client case study, how long did it take to achieve the results that you spoke to?
Right. Yeah. So traditionally, we look to work with clients for the long term. It's not sort of come in quick fix and we'll achieve everything. And in the work that I described there, looking at the different levers, usually something like that is that the benefits is small incremental improvements over a period of time is what generates the results. It's not that sort of quick fix and quick win. Having said that, that business, what you saw in those numbers was achieved in 18 months, which is, for 18 months to increase by 10 million is a great example, but it's doable. A few simple things there, managing the financials more effectively. But what I would say is the role of the FD is really to work with the business for the long term, understanding what's that end in mind and working back from that, whether it's an exit or growing the business or an acquisition, whatever that might be. So we do look to the long term, if that makes sense. But that particular case, the operational aspects were achieved within 18 months.
So the operational changes can derive quite early benefits, where strategic is the longer term foundations, in a way, of a successful business.
That's probably true, actually, Michael. Yeah, when you're sort of working out the roadmap and the strategy, that is going to be for the duration. And there are a number of sort of quick wins that you can find in the operational aspects. So probably fair to say. Interestingly, we probably, and as I described in the way I presented as well, I was trying to follow the methodology that we have. We start with the end in mind. Then we start with that strategy, what we're trying to achieve. But then, of course, we'll find operational benefits as we go early on in the relationship.
Yeah, there's two things actually coming up from that, really. Reminded of the well-known saying, but often forgotten: volume is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is reality. And I just wonder how many business owners you come across who are fixated by top line growth to the detriment of the other levers. I mean, is that the majority, or only a few, or is it, what's your feel for businesses in terms of fixating on revenue growth?
That's a really interesting, again, a classic. And I told the story of the building services business. It's like, if I grow my volume, surely that helps me. Somebody who doesn't fully understand the dynamics of working capital. And that saying that you say is absolutely spot on. And hence the reason for presenting it today as well, because a lot of businesses, we're in an exciting period over the next 12, 18 months for businesses. There's a lot of cash in the economy. Businesses are set to grow. There's a lot of cash in people's pockets, and they're going to feel that growth. But managing that carefully and sustainably through that is going to be really important. And hence the paradox that I alluded to earlier about and linked to cash is king. That business that I described there's a good chance it wouldn't have been here today if we hadn't gone in there and managed the cash. Without cash, it's the lifeblood of business. It doesn't matter how profitable you are. If you haven't got the cash flow, then your business cannot operate. So it is king for sure. Yeah,
it's absolutely correct to say that you only run out of cash once as a business.
Sure.
I've got a question here. Well, I'll come to that in just a moment, because that's about the legal sector. I just wanted to ask you one other thing that really chimed with me, which is it's very important for a business to start with the end in mind. So when I'm advising clients on disputes, and I'm sure the same with Paul when he's advising corporates on sales or other matters, that we identify with the client what their objective is right at the outset, and that guides everything. And it's interesting to see that you said that's really, really important in what the FD Centre does for its clients. And I just wondered, do you ever feel for what proportion of businesses you see have got a really clear strategy with a very well-defined endpoint? What sort of level of what proportion of businesses do you see in broad terms that will have those clear strategic goals or strategic goal singular?
Yeah, it is interesting. There's a whole mix of them, and we've done events, actually workshops, and we've asked that question often. And we ask sort of three questions. We say, have you got an end in mind? And if you have, does your team know about it? And does everybody know about it? And it's quite interesting. My experience, and what we found with those events is that largely, generally, the owner has an end in mind. They've kind of got an idea. I want to exit at some point. I'm not absolutely sure how much, but this business is where this is where I want to take the business. Sometimes this is a family business. It's through several generations, and I'm continuing that journey. I've got my family that are going to be taking over or part of the business now. This is a long-term journey we're on. And those ones are more challenging because we really have to put a strategic plan together that moves towards that growth. But generally, we find there's a sort of reasonable idea of what that end in mind is. But whether the rest of the team knows about what that is. That's more of the challenge, and whether it's communicated, and then more importantly, whether it's something that everybody's thinking about consciously every day. And as I mentioned earlier on, the key trick here on business strategy is to get this into everybody's day job. So, because they're naturally going to fall into the daily operations, but understanding what have I got to deliver this month, this quarter, it's really important that people focus on that. And I meet lots of people. I'd say a small percentage, 5% of the people I meet have got all of that in place, and everybody's thinking about it consciously every day. It's much less. There's a lot of people that think about it, it's there somewhere, or they may have communicated. But being active, like I've described this morning, and really having that as part of your, the daily activities, or linked in there somewhere in everybody's sort of day job, it is the difference between businesses that really accelerate their growth and those that kind of find their way over a period of time.
No, I think you make some really important and valid points there, Jeremy. There's no point knowing what the objective is if you haven't told the team what it is as well. And perhaps more importantly, they've bought into it as well. Yeah. Buy-in process, really important. That's for another time, maybe. So we've got 2 questions now. That's excellent. So if anybody else has a question, please do type them into the Q&A. So the first one is about data, which is obviously a huge issue in 2021 and beyond. So I'll paraphrase it. So the legal sector, is it a big issue? Do you think given the legal sector storing a high amount of sensitive data and personal client information, data breaches or cyber attacks looking to exploit that company are a major risk or an increasing threat for law firms? So I think it's yes. The answer is yes. It is a major threat, and I know that my firm has very rigorous protections in place. This almost sounds like famous last words, but we've moved on to encrypted communications with our emails with clients, for example, where appropriate. And so it is a big issue. We have we're very aware of our data compliance requirements. So yes, it is, and I think eternal vigilance is the price of safeguarding your business. And I don't think it's just law firms. I think other businesses can face these challenges. And I was talking earlier about businesses which can trade in the digital world easily, and I think those are equally at risk because they're data-driven businesses by and large. And so they must beware also. So yes, it's an increasing risk and an increasing cost of doing business for law firms and other data-driven or service-type businesses which increasingly trade in the digital world. I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to add anything to that. Sorry, but I think I covered the question. But I don't know if you want to add anything to that about data security.
Yes, just a couple of observations, if I may. I mean, first of all, all our staff are trained rigorously on data protection issues through online tutorials and so forth. And I know a lot of firms do the same thing as well. There's the dual verification on devices like your phone and that sort of thing to try and stop people hacking into them. When it comes to moving monies around, which is something that a law firm does all the time, we have a requirement that any emailed bank account details are verified on a phone call or a Teams call or something like that, to make sure that they've actually come from the client, not from somebody who's hacked the client's email account. Like a lot of other law firms, we've had to invest a lot of money in the sort of firewalls and protections and things that stop attacks coming in. And what else? The other thing as well is if somebody does have a problem, if, for example, they've clicked on an attachment on an email that's come from a dodgy source. Sort of no culture. People would say, "Look, I've done."
Paul, we missed that sentence. Could you just repeat that, please? You just
Sorry.
broke off for a second.
Okay. I was saying that we've also encouraged, through a sort of no blame culture, people to feel comfortable to, as it were, fess up if they think, for example, they've clicked on an attachment that turns out not to be what they thought it was going to be, so that it can be stamped on very quickly if it turns out that it contains a virus or something like that. But we do get people trying to get into the system, but fortunately, and touch wood, the investments that we and most other law firms have made have given us pretty good protection. But it's something for which we're constantly vigilant, because you hear so many anecdotal examples of businesses getting caught out in one way or another.
Yes, thanks for those points, Paul. I think it's worth noting that the head of our business systems team sits on the management board, which is indicative of the importance of IT and protection of data to this business. I'm sure the same is repeated in many other businesses. It's 20 years ago, there was somebody who was an IT manager somewhere in the firm, but he certainly wasn't on the management board. So I hope that answers that question. Another question is about the return to work after the 12 months of remote working. And just pausing for a moment, this is the second time in 12 months that I've actually worn a suit, but this is a bit of odd times indeed, whereas previously I probably wore a suit every day. I wonder, the question is, what new and, in our opinion, are the most significant challenges businesses have and will face in returning to work, sort of office work after the remote working period? Well, I think in our experience, remote working has worked very well in many ways, and we have our stated aim is to be an agile firm, so that people can work when and where they want. So there is a management challenge around that to ensure that colleagues have the right level of supervision and support, and there's good communication. But like I was saying earlier, where would we be if we didn't have smartphones, laptops, the internet? And that does, and Teams, this webinar on Zoom, we'd have to drive 30 minutes somewhere to attend a physical seminar, very convenient. So I think the challenge is around management primarily, that's my perspective, but I'm sure there are potentially challenges about productivity. So the people transitioning back, it's slightly the daily routine is not constant, and that can be challenging. But broadly, we're moving into a new and different kind of way of working. To echo what Jeremy was saying earlier about a way to work, how do we work? And everything is much more flexible and agile, and that brings its own challenges as well as its opportunities. So I think it's all around being able to help and support colleagues achieve productivity in an uncertain kind of environment where you may be working part-time in the office and part-time at home. So that's how I see it. I don't know, Paul, if you want to chip in with any observations, and also Jeremy, perhaps.
Yes, but I think a recent survey that we did amongst the staff showed that it was over 60% of the staff said that they would like to work probably at least half the week at home going forward as a sort of permanent arrangement, and that they had found that it worked well. Obviously, the question of the extent to which people can work from home depends on the need for supervision of them. I think people who are perhaps trainees will probably need to be in attendance more, because it's much more difficult to supervise people and hold their hand metaphorically remotely. So I think it's likely that people who are trainees will be coming in or be expected to come in more than people who are more senior and capable of working independently better. Some people are very weary of working at home and come in whenever we've been allowing them to do so. And the other thing that it's giving us sort of more medium and longer term scratching of heads on is the question of future premises requirements, because how much space will we all need, even if we grow significantly in size, how much more physical office space will we need in the future? We've recently reconfigured our Norwich office so that it's almost like a permanent hot desk arrangement, and that may well be a model for our other offices when they go into refits at a later date.
Yeah, I think just listening to both you, Michael, and Paul, I think that sort of links back with what I'm hearing. A lot of businesses now are looking at their offices. They're looking at do we need to be in the office every day, and remote working has worked well, etc. There's also there's going to be some challenges. I think there's going to be some HR related challenges. I think there's going to be some compliance challenges that we will need to be looking at the safety of people. There will be people that are genuinely afraid, and they will need to be talked to, and solutions will need to be considered, something that we would never have thought of before, and creating safe environments and being supportive. And I think HR will play a key role over the coming months and year on that aspect.
Absolutely agree with all those points. So hopefully, yeah, I think the final thing to say about that is that successful businesses will adapt to the changes and challenges which are thrown at them by the pandemic and the economic turbulence which lies ahead. And the less successful businesses will those which don't change and adapt. And won't be surprised for me to say that businesses which take advice from their lawyers and the FD Centre and other advisors are more likely to prosper in these uncertain times than those that don't. And with that rather self-serving, ringing endorsement of all that has been said earlier about how to protect your business, the 5 key legal issues, how to survive and thrive potentially in the due diligence process with the expert advice of Paul and his team, and most importantly, perhaps of all, to increase the financial value of your business through operational and strategic financial management. I would now like to invite you to enjoy a coffee and a croissant or some other piece of food item at your own expense, sadly, in your own home or office. And hopefully in the not too distant future, we will all meet in the virtual world, and we will be able to offer you coffee and croissants and other patisserie items which you would enjoy with us and do some networking. So with that, closing remarks. Thank you all for attending. Staring at a computer screen is not the most enjoyable thing, but I hope that you found this worthwhile. And do, by all means, send in some feedback. We're always very keen to hear about what is good and what is even better of what we have said. So thank you to Paul, thank you to Jeremy, and thank you to the Ashtons Legal BD and marketing team who put on this seminar so brilliantly well. I can't believe how stressful it is to do a webinar, but they have made it a really easy process. And so most of all, thanks to them. Cheerio, everybody. Enjoy your day and enjoy the weather. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Thanks,
Cheers.
Jeremy.
Bye now. Bye.
Bye.